Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, October 15th, 2019. Time for yet another show. Time to arrest Rudy Giuliani. It's an exciting day, as you can see, both by our morning post and Bill's tweet from all the way from Portland, Maine for this morning. Daily Coast Radio is live now. Today's show imparts a more optimistic tone, as in the mighty words of Kagro X, me, David Waldman. They don't sound that mighty when I say them, I guess. But it's beginning to look a lot like Rudy Giuliani is going to Giuliani. Look it up. It's a word. Wasn't sure whether I really needed that link or not, whether all people had heard of this ancient and archaic spelling of the word jail. But way back, I guess, and I don't know, would this be like a Middle English spelling? I don't know where it comes from. All I remember is learning it in like 10th grade and being fascinated by the fact that at one point in English, jail was at least alternatively spelled G-A-O-L, and I thought that made a good fit for Giuliani. I'm getting a little tired of the old 9/11 Giuliani spelling, and not, it's funny because so many more online participants these days do not really remember Rudy Giuliani as noun verb 9/11 Rudy Giuliani. They know what it's about, but they just don't remember him in that role. So, you know, it's we're always looking for something new and interesting and different. So, yeah, it sounds like yesterday's closed session deposition, I guess it wasn't testimony per se, but I guess, well, testimony was certainly provided, regardless of what they called it, by Fiona Hill, who I knew nothing about going into it, although I will say when I saw the tweets about her heading to Capitol Hill to provide this testimony, to participate in this closed deposition, as it was styled, and I saw the photo of her on her way in, she certainly looked no nonsense to me. She certainly looked, and grim at that. Well, at least she had a grim task ahead of her, and didn't appear to relish doing this, undertaking this task. But I don't know. I'm not certain that that's the subtext of what we've been left with afterwards, because it really seemed like she was dying to spill the beans, as it were. So we will catch up with what's going on with her, read a couple of this. I think we might just have to read through a couple of the stories and of her testimony and the backgrounders on her, because it sure looks like Rudy is in serious trouble. Plus, of course, much more important, I think, than even that, is that Mike Mukasey, why am I saying Mike Mukasey? Well, Michael Mukasey, I think, was teamed up with Giuliani on one of his stupid legal representatives. I'm thinking of Mick Mulvaney, the other MM, not Marilyn Monroe, not, who else would maybe make a Mickey Mouse, for instance. But, not Mulvaney, but the other malarkey fellow. Oh my gosh. Anyway, I think it's fairly serious for him as well. He's been pulled in on this. The big takeaway that everyone was running around with last night was the word that she was spilling the beans not only on Mulvaney but on Giuliani at the direction, it seemed, of John Bolton. Now, I don't want to get into a situation where I'm thinking of John Bolton as having done something admirable or heroic, and I don't know how heroic it really was, and I'm not really sure why he did it either. So before, I'm reserving judgment on what moved him to do this, and going to studiously avoid calling him a hero for any of this. I mean, I don't know that he put the country before his party or before himself. He may very well have simply been looking out for number one, which, in the end might work out very well. He may simply be looking to get people out of his way so that he can invade Iran without distractions. I don't really know. But he did the thing, and That's pretty good. We'll take that. And the fact that he implicates Mulvaney in all of this is, well, only better. Let's see. I saw this first, I guess, being retweeted around last night. I guess the one that really set the alarm bells off for me and for a lot of people in my timeline was the tweet from Peter Baker at the New York Times, who sent this one around yesterday with a breaking notice. Breaking, Bolton instructed aide, and that would be Fiona Hill, to report Giuliani pressure campaign to White House lawyer. And the quote that he dropped on this one is what really has got everyone's attention. It comes from the New York Times article on the subject, the quote being, "I am not a part of whatever drug deal Rudy and Mulvaney are cooking up," Bolton said. My takeaway from this, by the way, slightly different from everyone else, is that Mick Mulvaney is a drug dealer, which is amazing. I mean, I think everybody knew that about Rudy Giuliani, but Mulvaney, it was a big surprise. Anyway, so that, according to testimony given to the House investigators, another one of those joint sessions as between, was it intelligence and judiciary and who else? Oversight? Probably. I forget who's been holding these tripartite hearings. Yesterday, also big drama during the show, which I did not mention, which was congressional idiot Matt Gaetz being booted out. I guess it wasn't judiciary. It wasn't one of the three committees, taking part in yesterday's proceedings with Hill, because Gaetz, who is on the Judiciary Committee, apparently showed up and wanted to sit in on things, although he probably also wanted to speak and disrupt things while he was there. And he was booted from the room because it was a closed hearing for members of these committees only. And he tried to make a big stink outside the committee room, and they tried their best to spin it into Democrats are banning Republicans. Charlie Kirk, I think, was out there with that one. Banning Republicans from these hearings, and how dare they, and whatever happened to transparency, as if they were following all the rules about, their own hearings back when they were investigating everything under the banner of Benghazi. But at any rate, he didn't have any particular right to be there. And so he was booted out, and everyone sort of laughed at him for a while he was crying about this stuff. And, somewhere I have video of him, mewling about this stuff. Let me make sure I've got the New York Times article queued up here, and then I can go back and see if there he is. Matt Gaetz, The Hill was reporting with a little video of him. This morning, we see further evidence that Adam Schiff's clown show of an impeachment proceeding continues, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, you got to be on the committee that is holding the hearing. Sometimes, though, actually members of Congress can occasionally sit in on or even be permitted to ask questions during a hearing, but usually during open ones, not closed ones for members only. He thought that, I guess his claim was that because he was a member of the Judiciary Committee, and Judiciary was ultimately, under the Pelosi plan, supposed to coordinate all of anything that would come out of the rest of the investigations that would be turned into impeachment articles would, under the plan, be routed through the Judiciary Committee. That's not necessarily the case, but it's often been the case that judiciary is the place to handle impeachments of all kinds. And so he thought, well, eventually, since it's coming back through my committee, I want to see what's going on here. I would not like to sit in on this deposition, but that's at the discretion of the chair. It does happen very frequently. If you wanted to attend a infrastructure week hearing of some kind about a project in your district, though you didn't sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, by permission of the chair, you can be allowed to do that. Now, absent the permission of the chair, that's that. You're out. So, brusque encounter with the rules there for Matt Gaetz, and I'm glad of it. All right, let's see. Let's switch over to the Times coverage of the events of yesterday that gave everyone such a thrill who was so interested in hearing, well, bad-mouthing of Giuliani and Mick Mulvaney allegedly from John Bolton, who has done one thing for which we are grateful, even if it isn't necessarily a good or selfless act in the end. All right, Peter Baker and Nicholas, as he styles himself in the byline, teamed up on this New York Times piece. Bolton objected to Ukraine pressure campaign, calling Giuliani a hand grenade. There's more fun quotes in here. All right, let's see. And the picture illustrating the piece here is the very determined-looking Fiona Hill on her way into the proceedings. I was going to say, again, grim, but I suppose that carries too much baggage. And we don't want to say that about, a serious-looking person who happens to be a woman doesn't necessarily have to be grim. Grim news, certainly for those she's spilling the beans on, but determination, I think, is a fairly neutral way of putting this. How about that? The effort to pressure Ukraine for political help, remember that, provoked a heated confrontation inside the White House last summer that so alarmed John R. Bolton. How alarmed was he? He was so alarmed that, then the National Security Advisor, that was John Bolton. That's bad writing for me to have to jump back in on. I didn't realize that was coming next. How alarmed was he? He was so alarmed that guy, Bolton, told an aide to alert White House lawyers. House investigators were told on Monday. And again, here, it's a little difficult to know for sure if you really dive into this. What does it mean, alert White House lawyers? There could be several reasons for alerting White House lawyers. One could be that the most titillating of them is, oh my God, Giuliani, and I guess in this case Mulvaney, are so determined to break the law in pursuit of an illegal quid pro quo that I need to alert Johnny Law. Well, not the cops here, but the White House lawyers. They need to step in and tell them the things you're doing are illegal and put a stop to it. Could that have been what the alert was about? Could it have been, I intend to file a whistleblower report or have someone else file a whistleblower report? I want those people landed in legal jeopardy. That could have been it. Could it have been, I just want to go on record saying, as I said, this isn't my drug deal here. It's these idiots. I want nothing to do with it, and I'm just separating myself from it legally by being the one to report it and being the first mover. That could be it. And then, of course, one final possibility that I am willing to discuss, and there are probably 50 other ones I'm missing, is, oh my God, we need the White House lawyers' help in containing this and covering it up. Please alert them that they need to start a cover-up. That could have been it, too. Not that we can tell what Fiona Hill's thoughts were on this, at least not from this first paragraph. Maybe it's in the rest of this article. We should continue. Mr. Bolton got into a tense exchange on July 10th with Gordon D. Sondland, the Trump donor turned ambassador to the European Union. More on him later on, and he is a moron. He was working with Rudy Giuliani, of course, the president's personal lawyer, allegedly, to press Ukraine to investigate Democrats, according to three people who heard the testimony. The aide, Fiona Hill, testified that Mr. Bolton told her to notify the chief lawyer for the National Security Council about a rogue effort by Mr. Sondland, Mr. Giuliani, and Mick Mulvaney, the, need our sound effect, the acting White House chief of staff, according to the people familiar with the testimony. I am not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up. Oh, okay. I thought that was about Giuliani. And as a matter of fact, maybe this is an update to this, or a rewrite on this. I'm not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up. Mr. Bolton, a Yale-trained lawyer, told Ms. Hill to tell White House lawyers, according to two people at the deposition. Another person in the room initially said Mr. Bolton referred to Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Mulvaney, but two others said he cited Mr. Sondland. How interesting is that? Okay. I still think Giuliani is a drug dealer, but that's all right. I had no idea about Sondland, But, step it up. Get your drugs, everybody. Gordon Sondland, drug dealer. Mulvaney, we now know. Anyway, it was not the first time Mr. Bolton expressed grave concerns to Ms. Hill about the campaign being run by Mr. Giuliani. Here's our hand grenade quote. Giuliani is a hand grenade who's going to blow everybody up, Ms. Hill quoted Mr. Bolton as saying during an earlier conversation. The testimony revealed in a powerful way just how divisive Mr. Giuliani's efforts to extract damaging information about Democrats from Ukraine on President Trump's behalf were within the White House. Ms. Hill, the senior director for European and Russian affairs, testified that Mr. Giuliani and his allies circumvented the usual national security process to run their own foreign policy efforts, leaving the president's official advisors aware of the rogue operation, yet powerless to stop it. Again, a fairly serious situation. And think back to the discussion we had a couple of days ago, sometime last week, about the importance of process in these things. It's not just, fun esoterica. There's a reason why these processes are put in place. Pardon me, just caught up in the morning coughing here. You all have your morning coffee. I have the morning coughing. Okay. Well, you'll recall, of course, that discussion, I hope, and the takeaway of it being these processes are put in place, one, to eliminate even accidental conflicts of interest or creating legal jeopardy for people. The processes are established sometimes by law, sometimes by agency rule and agency guidance, so that when something goes wrong and there's an investigation and they are looking into the steps that led up to this mistake, whatever it is, even if the processes that you follow were flawed, the fact that they are set out as policy, if you stick to the letter of policy, generally speaking, you're going to come through this okay, with the, exception at the extremes of, for instance, following illegal orders. But there are procedures about that and how you're supposed to deal with illegal orders. Follow those, and not only will you be okay for on charges of following illegal orders, but you'll be okay on insubordination charges as well, if you're talking about like military justice, for instance. But that's what these procedures are there for. The Giuliani, Trump, and I guess Mulvaney, Sondland axis, however, are of a mind. I don't know that Mulvaney actually came to Washington this way, but once he signed on to Team Trump, it became a necessity. But Trump in particular loves to break away from these procedures as some sort of sign that he's mavericky and following his gut. Which is difficult not to follow, honestly. But the problem with it, of course, is he sees it as being flashy and thinking outside the box. And everybody else, I don't know what they're thinking about it is. They probably are trying to emulate that sort of outside of the box thinking. But, one of the boxes it's supposed to keep you out of is jail. That's serious. And it's, it's meant not only for your own protection, but of course the protection of all the rest of us. And it keeps the procedures, if you move through proper channels, not only will it protect you legally, but because policy moves through proper, predetermined, knowable procedural channels, you then know where to look to unravel the mystery of how something went wrong. And moving outside of those channels is good reason for investigators after the fact to determine that what you've done is improper and punishable per se, just because you did it outside of channels. It also by itself raises suspicion that you're aware that what you're doing is wrong. That's why you've avoided proper channels. The channels are there for accountability and for your own protection. They, of course, probably never believed they needed any sort of protection. And on top of it, they just thought they'd never get caught and that if they did, the president would pardon them. And the president loves to move outside of those channels, not only to be a mavericky rule breaker kind of guy, but because he doesn't know the rules, doesn't want to read them, doesn't want to spend any time on them, considers them to be red tape. And you know how businessmen are about red tape, even though he's not a businessman. All right, back to the New York Times here. Where did we leave it? Yes, at one point, she, that being Fiona Hill, the determined Fiona Hill, confronted Mr. Sondland, who is eminently confrontable looking, if you ask me, who had inserted himself into dealings with Ukraine, even though it was not part of his official portfolio. Channels, again, right? According to the people informed about Ms. Hill's testimony. The fact that Sondland is ambassador to the European community and he's involved in Ukraine, which isn't a member state, requires some, it's not impermissible by itself, but it would require him moving through proper channels. And once he moves outside of them, you have red flags going up all over the place. So, at one point she confronts him, not certain what it's about. Here we are. He told her that he was in charge of Ukraine, a moment she compared to Secretary of State Alexander M. Haig Jr.'s, to give him the full name there, declaration that he was in charge after the Reagan assassination attempt. I don't know how many of you all remember that, but the quote was very famous as well. More famous than the assassination attempt, I think. Anyway, this according to those who heard the testimony. She thought, we got an Al Haig here. According to whom, she asked. I don't know. Was that out loud? I guess it was. So he says he's in charge of Ukraine. She says, according to whom, very properly. And he says, the president, which he may have heard directly from the president, may not have. Might have been something Giuliani made up. Might have been something he assumed. I'm a rich guy and I own hotels, so is he. He'll back me up on this, no problem. Ms. Hill was the first former White House official to testify in the House impeachment inquiry, and her account provided a gripping, in-the-room view of the shadow maneuvers that have jeopardized Mr. Trump's presidency. How dramatic. While she left her post shortly before the now infamous July 25th phone call in which Mr. Trump pressed Ukraine's president to investigate Democrats, wow, shortly before the call, and still heard this conversation. That's amazing. She helped House investigators understand the early months of the pressure campaign. That's actually quite revealing now that it came to this sort of boiling point. Bolton sending her to the lawyers before the phone call. No wonder alarms were so quick to go off during the phone call. Everyone was already on alert. Everyone who wasn't involved in the scheme, anyway. The day-long interview with Ms. Hill, and yeah, I did hear that, I saw people tweeting that that her session had, at that point, gone on 10 hours. And so I don't know how much longer it went beyond that, if at all. But anyway, the day-long interview with Ms. Hill came as House Democrats widened their net in the fast-paced inquiry by summoning Michael McKinley, a senior advisor to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who abruptly resigned last week to testify on Wednesday. That is to say, Michael McKinley is the one who abruptly resigned. We only wish that Pompeo had done the same, I guess, although who knows. Why? I hope he stays there and covers himself in gasoline and hangs around lit matches. So, but I guess more spectacular stuff to come. Think about the dynamics of resigning last week and being ready to testify tomorrow, Wednesday. That's a very purposeful resignation. Career diplomats have expressed outrage at the unceremonious removal of Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch from Ukraine after she came under attack by Mr. Giuliani, Donald Trump Jr., who I thought he was busy running the businesses, and two associates who have since been arrested on charges of campaign violations. That would, of course, be Parnas and Fruman. The interviews indicated that House Democrats were proceeding full tilt with their inquiry, despite the administration's declaration last week that it would refuse to cooperate with what it called an invalid and unconstitutional impeachment effort. We should go back to that one, too. You remember that Greg brought us that article that said that the letter insisting that it was invalid and unconstitutional was bananas. It turns out that that letter was mostly, if not entirely, dictated by the famous White House lawyer Dotard J. Trump himself. one of the worst lawyers in America. So, running his own defense here and doing a terrible job of it. Keep it up. I absolutely want you to continue to do this. It's really entertaining. By the way, I guess spotted in one of those previous paragraphs there where they said, what was it? The fast-paced, Democrats widening their net in the fast-paced inquiry. I guess we are drifting every day, we should note, further and further away from yes, we can do a Ukraine-only, tightly focused on the phone call kind of impeachment. And it's landing exactly where we said it was going to land. The absolute inseparability of the Ukraine story from the Russia story. It's going to end up there again. I hope, though, by the time that it does, there won't be any Democrats left who shy away from the Russia angle of the story. It's actually quite interesting, if you ask me. All right. The interviews indicated that House Democrats were proceeding full tilt, right? And then there was the crazy letter. And, in our discussion of who wrote that one. 3 other administration officials were scheduled to talk with investigators this week, despite the White House statement. Mr. Sondland, who backed out of testifying at the last minute last week on orders of the State Department, is now set to appear on Thursday. So it's going to be quite a week. George P. Kent, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State who deals with the region, is scheduled to testify on Tuesday. I guess that's today, unless that's next Tuesday. Anyway, and the committee on Monday set an interview for Friday, a lot of days here, with Laura K. Cooper, a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Policy. Very interesting. And we'll be right back in 2 minutes to continue with the reading of this and get our heads on straight about the amazing developments. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. Except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We'll continue with our reading of last evening's hot topic New York Times piece here. We left off with the mention of George P. Kent, who's kind of a new name for us, and Laura K. Cooper, both Deputy Assistant Secretaries, one at State, that's Kent, and one at Defense, that's Cooper, who are set to testify later on. We'll see whether they have any explosive materials for us as well. Mr. Trump made no visible effort to block the testimony on Monday, even as he called on House Democrats to interview the anonymous CIA officer who first filed a whistleblower complaint alleging that the president abused power of his office by pressuring Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and other Democrats. I love the first use of the formal names in these things. Let's see. I wonder whether there was another comment here that I thought was of some use here. Yes. Really having to work hard to keep the throat clear today and not blow anybody's eardrums out like I did yesterday. I'm very sorry about that. Those of you who are podcast listeners were thankfully spared that by skillful editing. Actually, crappy editing. I just took out the most egregious of the throat clearings. The rest of it continued to bother the rest of you all throughout the show, I'm sure. Anyway, no visible effort to block the testimony on Monday, though there was an exchange of letters as between the counsels involved, the White House counsel's office, I guess, issuing a letter immediately prior to, or maybe even during the beginning of Hill's testimony, basically reiterating this whole thing is a sham, and what she's telling you is privileged information and you can't use it. And a very good response from Hill's own attorneys saying, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You have a totally wrong idea of what executive privilege is and what it covers. Stop trying to scare people. Real lawyers who are on the other side know that you're talking out your ass. Go, whatever. Go jump in a lake. We're testifying. This information is out there. There's nothing you can do anymore. Be gone. You have no power here, right? Be gone before someone drops a house on you too. Okay. Let's see. A total impeachment scam is all I guess Trump had to say on Twitter about it. Later in the day, he posted a number of video clips of Mark Levin, who also doesn't know anything about the law, on Fox News, excoriating the Democrats for pursuing impeachment, quoting the television host, calling it a silent coup effort. That's all caps. That's my all caps voice. Coup effort. Ms. Hill's testimony, which unfolded behind closed doors over 9 hours in the secure rooms, 9 hours in the secure rooms of the House Intelligence Committee on Capitol Hill, has been highly anticipated because of her position in a key job coordinating policy toward Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of Europe. See, even they don't separate Russia and Ukraine. The House Intelligence Committee issued a last-minute subpoena Monday in the morning to compel Ms. Hill to speak with the investigators, according to an official involved in the inquiry, to make it easier for her to justify ignoring the White House's clear opposition to cooperation with the House inquiry. Ms. Hill testified that she opposed the idea of the July 25th phone call between Mr. Trump and President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine because she did not understand its purpose. While it was described as a congratulatory call, do not congratulate, following parliamentary elections in Ukraine, Mr. Trump had already made a congratulatory call to Mr. Zelensky in April after his own election. You see, that's all that would be necessary there. So, let's see. I'm watching things fly by here that I can use to supplement our coverage later on. I want to make sure that they are available to us. So, yes, he had already congratulated Zelensky on his own election. There wasn't really much to congratulate him about at this point. I guess the excuse was, well, now his party has also won a majority in Parliament, and so they begin to form a government and we get some idea of the direction of things. But that's not something that you needed to congratulate the president on. But, okay, so that was the excuse given, and Hill wasn't buying it. She was not told that, and again here is another indication of the importance of procedure and proper channels. The fact that there was no congratulatory call necessary raises a red flag. They take this stuff seriously. Like you could, okay, you figure Trump knows nothing about how this stuff ordinarily works. He congratulated himself when, after the midterm elections, which Republicans got trounced in, but he made sure to congratulate himself over the Senate results as though they were something spectacular. So, in his world, maybe a congratulatory call after the parliamentary elections is warranted, but it's so out of the ordinary that, especially for a foreign policy staff already on alert for the shenanigans of Giuliani and others, but even without it, they probably would have said, this doesn't make any sense. There's no reason. Don't get on the phone, especially if you have a dotard president. Don't put them on the phone with foreign leaders unless there's a specific reason for there to be a call, and you can't avoid a call. That's how specific the reason is. or two, make sure he's thoroughly briefed, which he'll refuse, and is adequately staffed, which he likewise will also refuse. So several red flags go up. When Trump wants to get on the phone with a foreign leader and there's no burning necessity for it, that probably puts her antenna up. All right. So she was not told that Mr. Trump would use the call to press for an investigation into Mr. Biden, nor did she know about the president's decision to withhold the $391 million in American assistance to Ukraine until shortly before her departure, according to one person informed about her account. Now remember, she left before the call, so it was in circulation within the national security staff and the diplomatic corps, at some levels anyway, that Trump was about to use this phone call for collusion. He was going to demand this of the Ukrainian president, and everybody knew it. And that's why the alarms went off so quickly and the whistleblower moved so quickly following the call. The whistleblower probably knew before the call even happened, by a matter of days, what was going to happen in there and was just waiting for it to happen so that, the whistleblower had evidence of this thing having happened, not just that it was a plan at some point. All right. Her testimony did not establish a quid pro quo between the suspended aide and Mr. Trump's pressure for investigations, according to the person who was in the room for her account, I guess. But she confirmed that the administration leveraged a coveted White House invitation for Mr. Zelensky to a commitment to investigate corruption, which was seen as code for investigating Democrats. It's not even good code. But once again, the use of rudimentary code. Adoptions equals sanctions. Corruption equals investigating Democrats. Of course, it's only barely code, like I said, because, Trump, I think, genuinely believes that things that are done by himself, certainly, and Republicans generally, unless he's running against them in a primary, are not corruption by definition, whereas the things Democrats do, those are corruption. So when I say investigate corruption, I do mean investigate Democrats. I just don't have to say that. If you know what I'm thinking, then you'll know what to do. And if you don't know what I'm thinking, you're fired. Ms. Hill is a widely respected British-born former Brookings Institution scholar and intelligence officer. She is the author, with Clifford Gaddy, of Mr. Putin. It's not a children's book. It sounds like one, though. A critical biography of the Russian leader, and she was appointed Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs on the National Security Council staff in 2017. She turned over her duties to her successor on July 15th and left on July 19th, just days before the July 25th call. Yes, it's like the fourth time you've said that, and we know what it means if you leave on July 19th and the call's on the 25th. I know how calendars work. You can leave that part up to me. For much of her tenure, Ms. Hill found herself caught in the middle, a noted skeptic of Mr. Putin, working for a president who valued his friendship with the Russian leader. She came under fire from some of the most conservative figures and news media outlets around Mr. Trump. And by the way, here we should qualify for them at the times the use of the word conservative. Conservative figures conserved their attitudes towards Russia, even though Trump had a very different one. Trump thinks of himself as extremely conservative, and in many ways he is, and thinks his most ardent supporters are hardcore conservatives, but they are very much outside of conservative thinking on Russia, and we should note that whenever possible. And on a number of other issues probably as well. It doesn't mean that they're liberal by any stretch of the imagination. It just means they're fascist or stupid. There are many approaches to all of these issues. It's not binary. Okay, and we're all getting used to non-binary situations these days, aren't we? Okay, good. So we can apply them politically as well. Mr. Trump, I guess I should continue this or start again on this sentence. She came under fire from some of the most conservative figures and news media outlets around Mr. Trump, there you are, which portrayed her as an enemy within, even as some of her longtime friends and colleagues expressed disapproval that she had gone to work for the president in the first place. So that does feel like being caught in the middle, I guess. One of the most dramatic moments she described came in the July 10th meeting in Mr. Bolton's office that included Mr. Sondland, Kurt Volker, then the special envoy for Ukraine, and Rick Perry, the energy secretary. Oh, plus 2 Ukrainian officials, actual officials, not, I guess, Parnas and Fruman, just random Ukrainian-American nudniks. The purpose of the meeting was to talk about technical assistance to Ukraine's National Security Council. The Ukrainians were eager to set up a meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky, who was elected on a promise to clean up corruption and resolve the country's 5-year war with Russian-armed separatists. Mr. Bolton was trying to not commit to a meeting. According to Ms. Hill's testimony, Mr. Sondland got agitated, Ms. Hill testified, and let out that there was an agreement with Mr. Mulvaney that there would be a meeting if Ukraine opened up the investigations the White House was seeking. That seems pretty dumb to reveal. Mr. Bolton immediately ended the meeting abruptly, which I guess is fair. I mean, abrupt is very often thought of or used as a synonym for the immediate cessation here, but I guess it's doing a different duty here. You can immediately end the meeting politely, but you can also do it abruptly, which is about how you would imagine John Bolton would do it. As the group moved toward the door, Mr. Sondland said he wanted them to come down to the ward room next to the White House mess to discuss next steps. I don't know anything about the ward room. Mr. Bolton pulled Ms. Hill aside to instruct her to go to the ward room and report to him what they talked about. I don't even want to be near this thing, I guess. When she got downstairs, Mr. Sondland was talking with the Ukrainians and specifically mentioned Burisma, the Ukrainian energy firm that had Hunter Biden, the former vice president's son, on its board. Ms. Hill testified that she asked Mr. Sondland why he would be discussing this in front of their Ukrainian colleagues and tried to shuffle them out of the room and break things up. She's actually, at this point, trying to protect them from stepping in it, which is amazing, but also kind of, like I said, calls everything into a little bit more into question. When you're trying to, you can use it as an excuse to give yourself permission not to admire John Bolton, I guess. That's the easiest use of this information. At one point, Mr. Sondland mentioned Mr. Giuliani, who was involved in the discussions about a possible meeting between the two presidents. Ms. Hill went back upstairs and reported the encounter to Mr. Bolton, who promptly instructed her to report the issue to John A. Eisenberg. That's a name we have to get more familiar with. He's Deputy White House Counsel and the Chief Legal Advisor for the National Security Council, along with his line about the drug deal. Well, came this Bolton comment, which he meant metaphorically. No, so that's too bad. They actually put that in there to make certain that I couldn't mistake it for a literal truth. Oops, I just forgot what they said. I think it's literally true. There, I'm back on track. Mr. Eisenberg told Ms. Hill he would report it up his chain of command. See, he's going through channels, right? Up his chain of command, which would typically mean Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel. It was uncertain what he did at that point, but when the CIA whistleblower later filed his complaint, the agency's chief lawyer called Mr. Eisenberg at the White House. After several discussions over the following week, they decided the accusations had a reasonable basis. And, well, that's the end of the article, which is fine because I'm getting tired of reading this particular piece and wanted to move on to some of the other things that got put away either in the tweet stream or in Pocket. But pretty amazing, and it's been exciting to watch people digest this information. Let's see, going backwards chronologically through Pocket, we have this bit of news from Kyle Griffin. Gordon Sondland plans to tell Congress that Trump told him, Kurt Volker, and Rick Perry that any face-to-face meeting he would entertain with the new Ukrainian president would have to be cleared by Rudy Giuliani. This according to the Washington Post, which is sort of doing what looks like a profile of sorts connected to this issue of Gordon Sondland. Let's open that up. That was the key point, I thought, one of the key points that should be pulled out of this larger, more expansive article here. Disruptive diplomat, that enclosed in scare quotes, disruptive diplomat Gordon Sondland, a key figure in Trump impeachment furor, long coveted ambassadorship. Wow. That's, desperation there. Aaron Davis, Josh Dawsey, Michelle Yeehee Lee, and Michael Birnbaum have the byline here. Gordon Sondland was streaking over the West Coast in his Learjet. I like the fact that he was streaking. That's fun and interesting about him. Very bold move, I thought. Streaking over the West Coast in his Learjet in 2016 when the bad news came. Dramatic beginning to this. Everyone's a novelist today. Jeb Bush's campaign was on the phone. That is bad news. He was bowing out of the race for the White House. For more than a decade, Sondland's home in Portland, Oregon, not Maine, had been a fundraising outpost for establishment Republicans. Candidates hoped he would one day recognize, candidates he hoped would one day recognize his work corralling wealthy West Coast donors and reward him with a high-profile appointment, preferably, he told friends, an ambassadorship. That is, of course, not out of keeping with actual practice, somewhat standard and varying levels of intensity as between both parties. Very often, less than, well, I don't know what it's about. They're ambassadorships. If you are, it's a weird thing. It's funny because you would think that the super important countries, you might think, would get the most professional, nonpartisan representation to keep them away from the lunatics. But we're in an unusual situation here with Trump. And ordinarily, it actually ends up making, well, I don't know whether it makes more sense, but it is the case that our closest allies, and I guess another way of looking at it is those with whom we're closest, have the most tolerance for minor indiscretions when committed by close friends or ardent supporters of the president. And so it ends up being the case that ambassadorships to Great Britain, to, let's say Denmark, Sweden, Norway, prestige countries, France, occasionally, I guess Spain is sometimes included. No, but cushy assignments to developed Western nations where it's something of vacation to serve, often go to political appointees, and they're very often close friends, donors, etc. Whereas the tough work of being the on-the-ground representation of the United States government in, in Burkina Faso, for instance, or in remote, out-of-the-way places where the relationship between the U.S. and that country is technocratic and unglamorous. Those tend to go to the State Department civil servants. It's somewhat backwards, but anyway, the point is Sondland wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary by thinking that involving himself in politics as a donor and kingmaker that he could get a cushy ambassadorship out of it. So, Bush was the latest to disappoint when he dropped out here. Sondland, quote, kept talking about it, said a fellow Bush donor, adding that 2016 was not turning out remotely as we had expected. To realize his goal, Sondland made a political about-face and backed Donald Trump, a candidate he once said was out of touch with his, quote, personal beliefs and values on so many levels, unquote. Yet he was able to put this aside. After the election, Sondland contributed $1 million, and way to put it aside, right? $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee. And he began calling in political favors, including from Republican National Committee Chairman turned White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, remember that guy, to convince Trump that he could be a team player. Remember that, especially in the early days of the administration, if it is one, they were very wary of hiring on people who had ever been on board with any other campaign previously. But because he had given so much money to so many candidates, he could use Reince Priebus as leverage with the president, which was very There was only a brief window while that was actually effective, if it ever was. Anyway, now the lengths to which Sondland would go to impress Trump and to advance the president's agenda in Ukraine as U.S. ambassador to the European Union have made him a central figure in the congressional impeachment inquiry. Sondland is scheduled to testify under subpoena this week before House investigators. Before House investigators what? Have a chance to escape? No, in front of them, yes. Of particular interest is Sondland's work over the summer with U.S. diplomats in Kiev and Trump's personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani. Together, they pressed Ukrainian leaders to issue a public statement committing to investigating corruption at a Ukrainian energy company. Too specific, guys. The move would have tarnished the character of Trump's potential 2020 rival, former Vice President Joe Biden, whose son served on the company's board. The Washington Post reported Saturday that Sondland plans to testify that he understood that, in exchange for the statement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would receive a coveted invitation to visit the White House. Current and former U.S. officials and foreign diplomats say Sondland seemed to believe that if he delivered for Trump in Ukraine, I would have said if he delivered Ukraine for Trump, he could ascend in the ranks of government. To what? I don't know. A person close to Sondland disputed that notion, but other officials said Sondland had been talked about in the administration as a possible successor to Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Interesting. He keeps falling asleep, so why not? He spent a year trying to prove that he wasn't anti-Trump, said a former White House official who watched Sondland's role evolve. He got into the position of ambassador, and he had an opportunity to prove it. Trump knew that he wanted to prove his loyalty. Very exciting, I'm sure, for Trump. This story is based on more than 36 interviews with diplomats in the United States and abroad, current and former government officials, and associates and confidants of Sondland. Many spoke on condition of anonymity because they feared retaliation or were discussing sensitive diplomatic topics. Sondland, 62, declined, through an attorney, to comment, but his wife, Catherine Durant, criticized coverage of her husband, saying in an interview that only those motivated by self-interest were speaking. Well, Durant, why is she speaking again? Has mostly remained in Portland during Sondland's posting abroad, she said, helping to run the hotel business he founded. It makes sense. I mean, he's barely in Europe, apparently, so. But he's probably pretty rarely in Portland as well. He just hangs around Washington. She said she fears an economic backlash against the hotel company. Does anybody know? I mean, we've mentioned the name of the hotel company. It doesn't ring any bells for me. Already a prominent local company has cut ties with Provenance Hotels. If you're looking to cut ties, that's who you're cutting ties with. And a Democratic congressman, Earl Blumenauer, has called for a boycott until Sondland cooperates fully in the impeachment inquiry. That should be easy for me. Although I really have no idea what Provenance Hotels owns. I mean, I don't think they operate under that name in the hotel, but maybe they do. I don't know. I assume they're an ownership group, but I'll look it up. We live in a world right now where there's no upside to supporting someone like Gordon, who is working for Trump. It's a mob, Durant said. Well, he sold himself out. What can I tell you? She said her husband deserves a fair hearing. He's been extremely hardworking. He came from immigrant parents. We hate them, right? What's he saying that for? He's first generation here. He made his own wealth. He's worked his entire life hard. He's extremely generous. I mean, he'll sit down and listen to anyone, take his time, go to bat for them, give his money. Well, he's a sucker. But this environment is so sad and vicious that there is no one who will stick up for him. I find it really pathetic. Quite honestly, the pathetic part is asking someone to stick up for him. What can I do? He made his bed. Too bad. All right. The next section here, a collector of relationships. Interesting header. In March 2016, shortly after the phone call from Bush, which was described by two people with knowledge of it, Sondland was the headliner at the Portland Business Journal's monthly Power Breakfast. Everyone loves Power Breakfasts. More than 400 business leaders gathered in a ballroom at 7 a.m. Sondland took the microphone and began recounting his rags to riches tale. In Sondland's telling, the story begins with his teenage parents fleeing Nazi Germany. Very dramatic. His mother makes her way to Uruguay, which, honestly, I mean, I'll say this. Usually when you say, my parents fled Nazi Germany, you say, oh, they fled ahead of the Holocaust, they're Jewish or some persecuted group and very wisely left Germany before Hitler's forces could catch up with them. But there is another circumstance in which one could flee Nazi Germany, of course, and that could be after the war, where I guess technically you might argue it's no longer Nazi Germany, but it's just a disorganized Nazi Germany with a dead Nazi at the top of the hierarchy. But if you fled Nazi Germany, I don't know when, but okay, flag goes up. Like I fled Nazi Germany. Where'd you go? You hope to hear that they went to America or Palestine, for that matter, in hopes of establishing the state of Israel or something like that. But it wasn't easy to flee to America, particularly pre-war. We made it very difficult, so not a lot of people did do that. But he fled westward to Western Europe or something. But fleeing to South America from Nazi Germany, I'm sure there were lots of fine people who did that for the purposes of escaping the Nazis. South America was, I guess, as valid a destination as any, but in my mind, it tends to raise different flags, right? And at the end, it very much depends on when you fled and who you were fleeing. I fled Nazi Germany. It was still Nazi Germany. I was fleeing Allied forces, and I went to Uruguay to be able to live openly as a Nazi, or secretly as an ex-Nazi, hoping to evade the International Court of Justice, seeking retribution post-war. I don't know whether that's the case. I'm just saying that if you leave it at that my parents fled Nazi Germany and his mother went to Uruguay, I'm not certain that exonerates you in anything. There's more to the story, of course. We'll pick it up after this 1-minute break and continue with our deep dive into Sondland and see whether it's worth exploring his persona more. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Already clearing my throat, even after a break. Unbelievable day here today. Okay, so we were just learning that in Sondland's telling, his rags to riches tale goes like this. The story begins with his teenage parents fleeing Nazi Germany. His mother makes her way to Uruguay, while his father ends up fighting with the French Foreign Legion in North Africa. Again, I would ask for more clarification. I need more clarification before I make a ruling here. On the one hand, we're meant to take away from this, we didn't say he's fighting with the Free French in North Africa. He's fighting with the French Foreign Legion in North Africa. And that has its own cachet to it. And I guess we're meant to think of it as, well, he's fighting with Free French Foreign Legion resistors to the Nazis in North Africa. I don't know. I'm not certain what he was doing. Also, by the way, the record of the French Foreign Legion in North Africa, not fantastic all by itself. So this doesn't clear things up exactly for me. It feels like spin. But maybe it is exactly what we're meant to take away from it. Anyway, the two stay in touch through letters delivered by the Red Cross. How nice. They reunite after 6 years and make their way to Seattle, where they run a dry cleaning business. Well, certain thoughts about the dry cleaning business, but okay, I'll move on from that. That industry comes under scrutiny at some later date. Sondland is raised on Mercer Island, now an exclusive area east of downtown, but one that in the 1960s and 70s was more of a melting pot. Maybe. Okay, I'll take your word for it. Everyone mixed in the same high school, he recalled. And you know how people who just left Nazi Germany feel about mixing. I'm just saying, a lot of people had bad ideas about it. Anyway, so that created a lot of aspirational emotions when you saw some kids showing up on their 16th birthday with the new BMW that their parents had bought them, and some kids had to walk or take the bus. Okay, that seems natural enough. Interesting that he goes directly to BMW. I'm just saying, it's a German car, and it's kind of odd. But okay. It created a lot of interesting dynamics that probably followed me for the rest of my life. Sondland found success in business at an early age. At 28, as a commercial real estate broker, he was analyzing whether his firm should become the listing agent for a hotel in bankruptcy. Reviewing the company's financials, he saw an opportunity. He decided to look for investors and buy it himself instead. It was the start of what would become Provenance Hotels, a boutique chain with more than a dozen properties throughout the country. As the company grew, Sondland and Durant became known as major philanthropists in Portland. They donated millions of dollars to medical research, nice, homeless programs and the arts, beautiful, fantastic, including endowing in perpetuity free admission to the Portland Art Museum for anyone under 18. Very nice, and, evil bastards very often greenwash themselves this way. I don't know if that's the case with him, but okay. They're nice donations. But increasingly, his wife said, Sondland's obsession was politics. I don't know what you're into, but his sports, his golf, it's all politics, Durant said. He loves it. A lifelong Republican, Sondland became a bundler, a political fundraiser who collects contributions from other donors and then directs large 6 to 7 figure donations to campaigns. He backed Mitt Romney and John McCain that way. Sondland also has donated smaller sums to Democrats, particularly at the state level. Widening his network of wealthy donors seemed almost like a hobby for Sondland, said David Nierenberg, an investment advisor in Washington State who has known Sondland for more than a decade. I'm just saying it's probably coincidental that his name is sort of like Nuremberg, but it's Nierenberg, and I don't know. I have no idea. I'm trying my best to make this fun. But anyway, we do need to know this information. Some people collect cars, some people collect wine, collect books. Gordon collects relationships. And relationships with people who are active in public life are very important to him, Nierenberg said. What he didn't know until it was too late was that, again, what we've now learned is that everything Trump touches dies, and you should never collect, if you're a relationship collector, never collect the relationship with Donald Trump. Anyway, too bad for him. While the two men were raising money for Romney, Sondland told Nierenberg that he had expressed interest in a potential ambassadorship. He hoped to follow the path of two previous political fundraisers from the area who had been rewarded with ambassadorships by President George W. Bush. Charles, or Butch, as they call him, Charles Butch Swindells, really? And Bill McCormick of the seafood restaurant chain McCormick and Schmick's. I believe he killed Schmick in a fit of jealousy. I don't really know that to be true. Is there a Schmick, do you think? Anyway, very interesting. And they ended up as ambassadors, eh? Gordon indicated to me that it would be of interest to him to go to a German-speaking country, like Germany or Austria, since it would be a full circle for him as a child of Holocaust survivors. Nierenberg said, okay, so that clarifies things. Now we make the Holocaust survivor claim. And I figured that was the point of the story, but I was just saying he left some details out. And again, I will say this. If you're technically, if you are an SS guard at a extermination camp and you weren't prosecuted and executed after the war, you're a Holocaust survivor. I was there. There was a Holocaust going on. I was doing it. I survived it. I'm a Holocaust survivor. Why not? Right? In the same way that like apartheid era white South Africans who then emigrate to America say, I'm African American, right? They don't say that, but you could. Technically, it would be true. Okay. Let's see. We have, and of course, the sonic message here, letting us know an incoming message via one of my back channels. Okay, we'll take his word for it. That is a child of Holocaust survivors, presumably Jewish ones. He thought it would be a great idea to go to Germany or Austria. I guess. I mean, a German-speaking country. I guess they spoke German, so that's something. It seems like not the place necessarily that you'd want to go back. Although I could see going back and planting the banner again and triumphing in a post Nazi Germany or Austria might be something of interest, right? That was the old country for them. Why not Uruguay? But okay. Sondland's hoped-for path was also clear to Oregon developer Jordan Schnitzer, a Democratic donor and longtime friend. Sondland became very enamored, it says in scare quotes here, with the jet-setting lives of McCormick and Swindells, Schnitzer said. Gordon was very close to those people, and I think he admired the fact that they were ambassadors, Schnitzer said. So for a number of years, it's been clear for many of us he wanted to become an ambassador. Therefore, he became very generous with his political contributions. Generous is perhaps the wrong word. He's very pointed with his political contributions. And giving away money is sometimes considered to be a generous thing. And certainly the people who got the money thought he was being generous. All right. Karen, by the way, pointing out that the LA Times says his parents are Jewish. Not sure I'd question the timing of their fleeing Germany. Too late. I questioned it. I mean, that's something I think you need to be upfront about. That's just, and he may have been upfront. It might have been the Washington Post that's hiding the ball on that for some reason. I'm just saying, if your parents are Holocaust survivors, how do you talk about it? You say, my parents are Holocaust survivors. They fled the Nazis. My dad fought with the French resistance in the Foreign Legion against the Nazis in North Africa. Maybe he told it that way at the breakfast, and the Post, for some reason, in dramatizing things, decided to go another way. I'm just saying that's usually an upfront part of the story. And, I guess it's not out of character to then say, well, if my parents fled Germany, and I want to go back to show that you can't, kick the Sondlands out of Germany forever, I'm coming back. It is interesting that he had no interest in Uruguay or any Spanish-speaking countries. And I don't know what, and that his status symbol that he was first concerned with was the BMW. I don't know. Not just any German car. Bavarian. Okay, it happened. And I think he'll understand. In fact, I actually don't care if he understands, because he sold out to Trump, and quite honestly, that is going to probably do more damage with his standing in the Jewish community than anything else. So he's in trouble. I'm not putting him there, but I'm keeping him there. Anyway, moving on with the rest of the, thank you for noticing that. And she sends me the clip from the LA Times, which I guess wrote the story in a better and clearer way. As a Republican in the majority Democrat Pacific Northwest, majority Democrat, I don't know if I like that usage, Sondland developed an understanding of what he considered the transactional nature of bipartisan politics, which he hasn't been engaging in for some years now because he's a Trumpster. In the early 2000s, his financial support to the campaigns of George W. Bush helped put him on the radar for a modest appointment to the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. At the same time, his support for the Democratic governor of Oregon, Ted, I don't even remember this Democratic governor of Oregon, Ted Kulongoski, have I got that right? Led to an appointment as the head of the governor's office of film and television, because he likes TV, I guess. Whatever. The governor knew I had a relationship with the Bush White House and asked me to work on myriad projects, Sondland told the Portland Business Journal's breakfast audience. Oh, we're back at the breakfast now. As things came up, we would make these requests, and they were done quietly. They were done with rifle precision, and there was always a quid pro quo. The governor would help the president with something, and the president would help the governor with something. And it was very transactional. And that doesn't really explain things all that well either. There's lots of quid pro quos and transactional relationships that are valid and legal and fine and on the up and up. You do something for my constituency with government resources, and I likewise will use my government's resources to do something for your constituency. But it's only problematic when it becomes you do something with your constituency's money for me personally. That's a bad quid pro quo. We don't like that kind. All right. At the time of the breakfast, Sondland had not yet gone all in on Trump, a reversal that was in its own way transactional and that followed a path many other establishment Republicans have also taken. In August of 2016, Sondland and his business partner Bashar Wali, that's W-A-L-I, the surname, took their names off a scheduled Trump fundraiser. Probably a good idea for Bashar. After the candidate belittled the parents of Humayun Khan, remember that whole incident, the Muslim soldier slain in Iraq while serving in the U.S. Army. Remember, that was going to be the end of his career, I thought. Oh, well. Their company issued a public statement noting Sondland's parents' flight from Germany and Wali's immigration from Syria. In light of Mr. Trump's treatment of the Khan family, and Syria back in the news, right? And the fact his constantly evolving positions diverge from their personal beliefs and values on so many levels, neither Mr. Sondland or Mr. Wali can support his candidacy, the statement concluded. Well, that changed. Rob Freris, the president of an Oregon timber company who had been on the receiving end of Sondland's fundraising pitches, wondered whether Sondland was trying to protect his business empire, which is fine, especially since a Trump victory still seemed unlikely. I thought that because of where he is in the hotel business, it was just prudent for him to back away because of the threats or bodily harm or vandalism of his properties, Ferris said. Sondland's approach changed after Election Day. While he still didn't publicly support Trump in Portland, where opposition to the incoming president was already prompting street protests, Sondland donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee through 4 entities, including limited liability companies, state and federal records show. The contributions made him one of the top 50 donors to a record-setting inaugural haul of $107 million, which they didn't need any of because they hardly did anything for their inauguration, and Trump stole it all. But by the way, again, bringing up the fact that if you disguise your contribution by splitting it up and routing it through 4 limited liability companies, you have to then go back out of your way to reassemble this and go out of your way to let the people inside the White House and the political operation know that you did this. By the way, I'm responsible for all 4 of these donations. I gave $1 million. I'm hiding it from people, but I want you to know it so I can get the favors for it. And that should indicate to you that you're playing both sides of the fence and you're doing something wrong and you deserve the consequences when it comes around. When the donations were reported in 2017, everyone in Portland was pretty bummed, said a business associate of Sondland's. Gordon was a cutthroat, no doubt, but he had done so many good things for Portland, this seemed like a betrayal. Those who knew his ambition for becoming an ambassador were less surprised. Knowing of Gordon's interest in having relationships with people in power and knowing that he was sort of ecumenical about that between Democrats and Republicans, no, I was not surprised, Nierenberg said. Sondland's work to ingratiate himself with Trump was just beginning. He asked Priebus to recommend that he be appointed ambassador to the European Union, according to people knowledgeable about the exchange. Initially, Trump balked. He had a hard time winning Trump's approval because he left Trump during the campaign, said a former White House official familiar with the president's reaction. Maybe he ended up getting the job because the president really had no respect for the European Union and probably thought it was punishment. Sondland called on Trump's former campaign finance chairman, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who had invited former Bush donors to back Trump, to put in a good word, according to current and former White House officials. Sondland also sought the backing of Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. That's an easy backdoor in. Arranging a private dinner with them, officials said. See? Dinner gets you back in. He knows how to play Jared and Ivanka. To some in Trump's inner circle, Sondland's ambition seemed transparent. He was clamoring to be an ambassador. He gave a ton of money. He worked year after year, one official said. He likes to go to events, to be seen, to feel like he's in the room. Eventually, Trump decided Sondland was on his team. He announced the nomination on May 10, 2018. The role of U.S. ambassador to the European Union had long been considered one of the most nerdy jobs in the State Department, according to past office holders. People with previous government experience or skilled lawyers from the private sector have been tapped for the technocratic job of finding ways to build coalitions to advance American interests. So that would probably normally go to a career official. Culturally, past ambassadors have taken care to learn the lingo of Brussels, where it is assumed diplomats will understand that comitology refers to how the EU modifies its laws, and that the European semester is when EU countries coordinate their budgets with the bloc. Significantly, the ambassador's portfolio typically has included Europe-wide energy issues, including gas supplies that run through pipelines through Ukraine. So there is an entree there. That's interesting. Sondland came in with boisterous self-confidence and a conspicuous style. From the day he arrived in Brussels, the office's official Twitter account chronicled his every handshake and salute. He posted a YouTube video of him and his family at home making coffee and sitting on a couch introducing himself to his European audience. That ain't bad, right? In public appearances and in private meetings, Sondland often came off like a version of Trump with the roughest edges sanded off. Those are the ones you want off. According to diplomats who interacted with him, he once declared to American business representatives that unlike his predecessors, he would get crap, get stuff done, according to people who were present. He called the European Union out of touch. That's not a good start. And accused it of stalling on trade talks with the Trump administration. And he called himself a disruptive diplomat. That's his own words. From the outset, Sondland's ambition was clear, as was his fondness for the trappings of the job, said several who interacted with him. He began updating the U.S. ambassador's baronial residence on the leafy outskirts of Brussels in an effort that was still underway last week, according to a guard who said the residence was closed for extensive renovations. Contracts went out for tens of thousands of dollars in new furniture, $25,000 to an American rug company, and as much for the services of a custom woodwork and case maker, Federal Procurement Records show. It was a real 18th century Jefferson in Paris behavior, a senior U.S. official said. A person who has spoken to Sondland about the upgrades in the residence said the residence was, quote, nearly unusable for representational purposes, and renovations were a less costly alternative to the planned purchase of a new mission facility initially proposed during the Obama administration. I see. Early on, Sondland tried to invite the European Union's top officials, heads of state, to dine at the residence. The request raised eyebrows on the European side, officials said at the time, because ambassadors, even American ones, usually aim lower in the pecking order as a matter of protocol. At dinners and elsewhere, Sondland was aggressive in echoing Trump's rhetoric, telling people that Europe had been taking advantage of the United States on trade for decades, and sometimes punctuating his speech with four-letter words. In June, there's a diplomat. You're supposed to be diplomatic. In June, at a dinner with U.S. and European officials, Sondland was seated across a table from Baroness Catherine Ashton, a former EU foreign policy chief. According to two people who observed the encounter, he spoke at length about American generosity after World War II and how it paved the way for the continent's current prosperity. We teach school kids that. He asked why Europeans were not more appreciative, the observers said, and why his requests were so frequently rebuffed. This was 80 years ago. Ashton politely told him that the United States had also benefited from Europe's prosperity, said two American guests who observed the exchange. She did not return calls seeking comment. A few months into his posting, Sondland and Schnitzer were vacationing at their beach homes in Gerhardt, Oregon. I'm guessing it's not Gerhardt, but Gerhardt. That's according to Schnitzer. Sondland spoke about the challenges of navigating governmental bureaucracies and bemoaned what he saw as inefficiency, Mr. Businessman, Schnitzer said. But Sondland added that he got to meet all these European leaders, and he was often on first-name basis with them, even though you're supposed to address them as the president this or president that. He said, I could address them by their first name, Schnitzer said. I took it as he was building a number of impressive relationships. In recent months, Sondland's deep involvement in a new administration in Ukraine struck diplomats in Brussels and Washington as highly unusual given his role as envoy to the European Union, a large political bloc that does not include Ukraine. In July, on a visit to the former Soviet Republic, Sondland told a Ukrainian broadcaster that Trump has not only honored me with the job of being the U.S. ambassador to the EU, but he's also given me other special assignments, including Ukraine. But Sondland's plans to tell Congress this week, I guess he does plan to tell Congress this week that the roots of the confounding task of securing a pledge from Zelensky began in May. According to a person familiar with the testimony, Sondland attended Zelensky's inauguration that month. In an Oval Office meeting afterward, Sondland intends to say Trump told him, Special U.S. Envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker and Energy Secretary Rick Perry, that any face-to-face meeting he would entertain with the new Ukrainian president would have to be cleared by Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, who has no role in the State Department whatsoever, right? Sondland plans to say that over the following weeks, he and Volker, along with the acting ambassador to Ukraine, William B. Taylor, learned that as a condition of such a meeting, Giuliani was demanding that Zelensky's administration publicly announce it would tackle corruption, including singling out as a target Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company linked to Biden's son. Text messages that Volker has turned over to Congress showed the three struggling to negotiate the details of that statement with Ukrainian officials. Volker writes most often. Taylor frequently expresses concern. Sondland, at least one occasion, appears to speak for Trump's interests, writing on August 9th that, quote, POTUS really wants the deliverable. Volker did not respond to messages seeking comment for this story. Taylor declined to comment as well. Giuliani last week told the Post that Sondland seemed to be in charge of the overall effort. He said that Volker first raised the idea of getting the Ukrainians to issue a statement, and that Volker and Sondland were involved in the specifics of getting Ukraine to name Burisma. I said it should include collusion and Burisma, Giuliani said. It's quite possible we never mentioned Biden. Of course, Biden was part of that. Giuliani said that Sondland and Volker were often on conference calls together, and that Sondland was keeping tabs on Giuliani's work on the effort, speaking with him about 6 times over the summer. But according to the person with knowledge of Sondland's testimony, Giuliani had the more central role. Volker, Taylor, and Sondland were all just trying to understand through Rudy what the president's concerns were and to try to address them, the person said. That sounds actually like the more likely of the arrangements, even though it shouldn't be, because Giuliani has no role at state or anywhere in the government. Sondland plans to say he was unaware until a whistleblower's complaint became public late last month that Biden's son, Hunter, had been a Burisma board member, and that some government officials suspected Trump's goal was to tarnish the character of a potential 2020 Democratic challenger. In their discussions, Giuliani never mentioned the Biden connection, the person with knowledge of Sondland's testimony said. Sondland could face skeptical questioning on this point. In televised appearances, Giuliani had by then repeatedly raised concerns over Hunter Biden's role at Burisma, and numerous newspaper and magazine articles had questioned whether the issue could prove to be a drag on his father's presidential campaign. He's also likely to be pressed on his own interactions with Trump. The person close to Sondland said the ambassador spoke to Trump maybe 6 or 7 times as ambassador, including 3 times in the course of the Ukraine negotiations, though not about the statement sought by the administration. Last month, after speaking to the president by phone, Sondland sent a key text message. It said that Trump wants, quote, no quid pro quos of any kind. Trump and his supporters have held up that text as proof that none was ever considered. So you recall that was one that required a 5-hour pause in the text exchanges as he went and called Trump and said they're expressing this concern about quid pro quos, and he was instructed to go back into the conversation and say there just wasn't one, just isn't. And if you think there was, you misunderstand the president. The person with knowledge of Sondland's testimony said that Sondland took Trump at his word at the time, but that he has no knowledge of whether the president's statement was true, as he only learned details such as the importance of the Biden mention from the whistleblower's complaint. Nierenberg, Sondland's acquaintance from Portland, said he sent him an email recently urging that in the impeachment inquiry, Sondland tell the truth tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I think I've heard that on television somewhere before. Nierenberg said Sondland wrote back thanking him for the advice. Non-committal, I suppose, but good advice nonetheless. All right, well, I don't know. I feel like we learned a little something about somebody who's going to have a central role in the rest of the week anyway, and we'll get some idea of what sort of grain of salt you will need to take his testimony with. Apparently a grain of kosher salt is probably the best idea in all of this. And, wow, all right, I don't know. I find him a puzzling figure. We'll learn more about him later on. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let's include some more information in today's broadcast. I'm thinking back on, we're trying to move forward, thinking back on what we did yesterday, and it occurs to me that I am not 100% certain what we did and didn't include in yesterday's show and what happened post-show, but post-show yesterday, pre-show today, that we may have been discussing on Twitter but didn't get to during the show yesterday. Did we? I guess most of certainly a lot of my time yesterday afternoon was wrapped up in this, and I don't think that it made it. I think we didn't learn it before the end of the show yesterday, and a rather distressing possibility at that. Did we not discuss yesterday the fact that we're looking in Syria along the Turkish border at a fairly serious situation that could be developing? Of course, we know about the ISIS prisoners that the Kurds were holding on everyone's behalf, who are now largely sprung from prison. 11,000 ISIS-related prisoners now, I guess, on the loose in northern Syria. Trump, of course, insistent that they will move west in all likelihood, but settle in Europe, and he doesn't care about the fact that they are on the loose because they'll land in Europe and perpetrate, he believes, I'm sure. Maybe we all should believe that they would get involved in terrorist activities. Once again, some of them as recidivists and some for the very first time, I suppose. But do so in Western Europe, which he apparently hates anyway, and so he doesn't care. He was tweeting yesterday, who cares? They'll let everybody fight. The Turks and Kurds have been fighting since forever. Let them do it, because he's out for a Nobel Peace Prize. And we're 7,000 miles away. What do we care if they continue to fight? That's a far cry from what he used to say about ISIS, of course, but he's a flip-flopper, and I guess we should come to expect that. Don't normalize it, but we have come to expect it. But that was only sort of part of my concern about how things were developing. I forget where I found this out initially, although I think if I scroll back through my Twitter feed, we'll get a better sense of when that came up and where I got it from. Let's see. Yeah, let me continue to scroll back here and find out where this first came up for me. Yes. Let's see. I'm in the right time zone here. Here we go. Josh Rogan's tweet with an accompanying New York Times story. Over the weekend, I guess this is the key part of it, over the weekend, State and Energy Department officials were quietly reviewing plans for evacuating 50 nuclear weapons that the U.S. had long stored under American control at Incirlik. I'm guessing at my pronunciation here, Incirlik, I don't know where the emphasis goes, air base in Turkey. And that got a wow, both out of Josh Rogan and out of me. The Times story is more broad-based, and you've likely read it by now. Trump followed his gut on Syria. Calamity came fast. I'll read you the subheader, too, by way of summarizing the story. All the warnings were there, but President Trump's reliance on his instincts and his relationships led him to ignore the consequences of a move that has emboldened Russia, Iran, and the Islamic State. David Sanger has the credit for this piece. It's not all that long, but it's fairly lengthy. But the part that grabbed my attention, I don't think I've read through the entirety of the article, and may be worth doing. But the part that got my attention was what got Josh's attention, that over the weekend, the State Department and Energy Department had to, well, it says, quietly reviewing plans. I don't know whether those are existing plans and they're thoroughly vetted and tested, or whether they were trying to come up with plans on the fly. But 50 nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, they were described elsewhere, and I think I've got some more details on them now about what they actually are on this airbase in Turkey. Now, at the same time, of course, Turkey is, you could say, shelling American troops. Now, they're not actually trying to rain down on shells on their position and kill those troops, but they are putting them in harm's way, and as others have described it, bracketing them with artillery fire, making sure that they're stuck in place by because there's explosions going on all around them that will kill them if they move. And, that's not a friendly act. Turkey, a fellow NATO member, and yet shelling our troops. And, as in the status quo ante, I guess it was considered a relatively safe thing to do, to leave tactical nuclear weapons under American supervision on a Turkish airbase because alliance. But if you're now involved in semi or hostile activity with the people who are responsible for the maintenance of the base, that's kind of a problem. And of course, having some of your own nuclear weapons possibly fall into the hands of Turks who are questionable allies at this point, I guess, is a problem. But also having them in their hands or having their stewardship somehow uncertain, all just 250 miles from the Turkish-Syrian border, where 11,000 ISIS-related prisoners are now on the loose, and the situation is highly fluid and unstable, gives us reason to worry a little bit. Is Donald Trump on track to become the first American president to lose control of a nuclear stockpile? It looks and feels quite like that, I guess I would say. I found out some more information just searching around on what exactly is going on in the airbase from the Air Force Times, which I guess would have a better, closer view of these things. I thought I would take a look at this. With Turkey's invasion of Syria, concerns mount over nukes at Incirlik. And I guess again, not sure how that's pronounced. I'll check it out. Stephen Losey, Losey, I hope I've got his last name right, writing this for the Air Force Times. The Air Force on Monday, yesterday, said it has made no changes to daily operations at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, even as Turkish forces continue to push into Syrian territory, which has prompted U.S. forces to pull back under artillery fire. But concerns are, I add that, they didn't mention that. Concerns are growing over the reported presence of U.S. nuclear weapons at Incirlik, believed to be about 50 B-61 gravity bombs. The New York Times on Monday reported that officials from the state and energy departments over the weekend reviewed plans for evacuating the nuclear weapons there. Whether those plans will be executed or are proper, we don't know. Not surprisingly, Air Force spokeswoman Ann Stefanik would not answer questions about possible nuclear weapons at Incirlik and whether they would be moved in a Monday email. That's maybe not something that you would necessarily broadcast, but we do want to know. The mission of the 39th, that is the 39th Air Base Wing at Incirlik, is to provide persistent surety and continuous air operations for the U.S., our allies, and our partners, and helps protect U.S. and NATO interests in the southern region by providing a responsive and operational air base ready to project integrated forward-based air power, Stefanik said. That's canned writing that, has been in place for 100 years. But she stated there have been no daily operations changes at the base. They don't know what to do, basically, is what's being said here. A senior official reportedly told the Times that the weapons, quote, were now essentially Turkish President Recep Erdogan's hostages. Since removing the weapons, now this is, hostages, I guess, is maybe metaphorical, maybe not. Why do we say this? So why does this senior official say that the weapons are now essentially Erdogan's hostages? Since it's because removing the weapons would effectively spell the end of America's alliance with Turkey. That would be a message. We don't trust Turkey anymore. We don't trust them enough to leave these weapons here because they're potentially vulnerable, in danger. We're in danger of losing control of these things. And losing control of 50 nuclear weapons is a fairly serious thing to have happen. And it's not something that you would worry about if you had a real alliance with somebody. If you don't, and they are shelling our troops, then moving them basically says, yeah, we don't really know what Turkey's status is here. They might be allies, they might be enemies, we might have nuclear weapons stuck there, we don't know. It's just, well, it's a little crazy out there, and that's bad news. So that's one choice. But if you don't remove them, keeping them there, of course, would leave them vulnerable. It'd be dumb, certainly could be very dumb in hindsight later on, to have left 50 nuclear weapons in a country that you were all saying, I don't know if I really trust these guys or not, but I'm afraid of offending them. So it may just be that the only play here is to just say, that's it. Turkey's just not really an ally. Or I guess you could, with diplomacy, you could play some kind of crazy game. Say, well, we're moving these things, but boy, do we love Turkey. They are our favorite allies. We just wanted to move these. There's a light that won't light on one side. I'm taking it back to my workshop. I don't know what excuse we're going to give here. The situation with Turkey, a NATO ally, has become increasingly volatile as Turkish forces tore into the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces after the U.S. pulled back and abandoned them. And that's the Air Force Times, abandoned them. A suspected Turkish artillery strike also landed about 300 meters from a U.S. commando outpost near Kobani, Syria, on Friday. Some troops and artillery experts believe the artillery strike was intentional, as the Turkish military had detailed grid coordinates showing them where American troops were. The Washington Post quoted a knowledgeable Army officer as saying artillery rounds had been fired on both sides of the outpost, creating a bracketing effect. In response to the Turkish artillery fire, arms control expert Jeffrey Lewis tweeted, "Seriously, it's time to take our," and they use the word here, effing nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Air Force Times says, the quote, "Seriously, it's time to take our effing nuclear weapons out of Turkey." The presence of nuclear weapons at Incirlik, although never publicly confirmed or denied by the U.S. government, has long been essentially an open secret. It became even less of a secret earlier this year when a Canadian senator published, apparently by accident, a document containing the bases where the United States is keeping nuclear weapons. What? Thanks a lot, Canada, or at least Canadian senator. I mean, what? I didn't hear about this one. Well, that's lucky for you, Canada. We didn't make a big deal out of that one. Oh, man. Well, we've probably ruined something of yours in the past anyhow. In an interview this summer with Air Force Times on the future of Incirlik, prescient, amid rising tensions with Turkey, I guess not that prescient then, former Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James would not confirm or deny the presence of nuclear weapons there, but hypothetically speaking, she said that if nuclear weapons did have to be removed from that base, it would be a complicated operation. Oh, fantastic. So the Trump guys are just the ones to do it. Rick Perry will take care of it. It would require negotiations with the nation that would become the weapon's new host, James said. Yeah, that's true. And it would require a great deal of logistical and security work. I would think so. It's always fascinating to look at what the realities of an operation like this are. I'm sure, like, to Trump, he's like, just put him on a plane. You know, that's not his voice, but you know how he's thinking. Just move them. Just put them on a plane and get them out of there now, in an hour, right? But what's the reality behind this? If they're nuclear weapons, they can't just be chucked in a box, right? If the Air Force found a new nation willing to host the nukes, and I guess you could just bring them back here. But again, even that would cause some issues, right? You find a new nation willing to host the nukes, James said, it would have to take the greatest of care in their removal and transport. Yeah, well, nuclear gravity bombs. If the receiving base did not have the facilities or security necessary, James said, it would require a significant construction effort, and NATO would likely be involved. And, of course, a significant construction effort for military construction, there's no money left for that because it's all been stolen for the wall. So think about that, too. Anytime nuclear weapons are moved from point A to point B, it is a major logistical challenge, James said. The security is enormous that goes with this. Good, it should be. The question of whether nuclear weapons should remain at Incirlik took on greater urgency following the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey. Do you remember this? I don't remember Incirlik's role in all of this, but I remember the coup attempt. And get this is another interesting part of the puzzle with respect to what's going to happen to these things if tensions with Turkey rise. During that coup attempt, the air base's power was cut off by Erdogan's government. So that's interesting. How about that? If Erdogan's government can, on its own order, cut off power to the base where the nuclear weapons are stored, and presumably a lot of the security has to do with using power in all of this. Concerns have only increased along with tensions between Ankara and the rest of NATO, especially as Turkey decided to accept a Russian-made S-400 air defense system in July. You might recall that was something that Lindsey Graham was saying he was really concerned about. And when we found out about that when he was prank called by the Russians pretending to be the Turkish defense minister. And he used his time with what he thought was the Turkish defense minister to say, we really want to encourage you to drop and not use the Russian-made S-400 air defense system and get back on our F-35 program instead. And apparently there's some interesting problems that having both creates. And you would think it's not just a matter of, well, we don't want you using Russian things because we don't want you growing closer to Russia, which you're not supposed to be doing because you're a NATO member. But the fact that you are a NATO member creates specific problems. Check this out. The U.S. and other NATO allies are concerned that Turkey's use of the S-400 could jeopardize secrecy on the F-35, the fighter jet, and its stealth capabilities. Bringing a Russian system into the alliance, NATO alliance, could lead to data leaks and security breaches and give the Russians critical information about the F-35. This is something I hadn't given too much thought to, but is definitely worth thinking about. Especially, we've given consideration on the program over the months and years that we've been doing it to spyware, and reminding ourselves that even the most innocuous items, electronic items coming from Russia or China, could in fact be infected with spyware, or could in fact be designed as spy hardware disguised as civilian hardware, and we'd never know what was going on inside a black box like that. So what do we know about the S-400 system? Probably not all that much. But, I could easily imagine a situation where the S-400 air defense system is stationed in Turkey and the Russian sales force on this one, but basically saying, look, there's sophisticated software that goes along with operating this stuff, but we'll need to update your software from time to time. And who knows what they're plugging in? And they're plugging it in now into the Turkish air defense system, a NATO allied country. Who knows what the interoperability between our computer systems is, and whether or not the Russians, through the implementation of the S-400 air defense missile system, are infiltrating NATO defense computers. We have no idea. And that's scary all by itself. Continuing with the article here, I might as well finish it up. There's only a few more sentences, but they're all equally scary. Right? So bringing a Russian system into the alliance could lead to data leaks and security breaches and give the Russians critical information about the F-35. And flying U.S. Air Force F-35s so close to the S-400 would make it easier for the Russians to gather data on their stealth and other capabilities. In other words, if you have an operating air defense missile system that's taking in all sorts of data from the on conditions around wherever it's installed, what's in the air, radar, signals, etc., the conditions in which it would have to operate, right? And processing all of that in the computers, we wouldn't know. I guess we wouldn't know. I mean, unless they've got sophisticated software that helps detect it, we don't know how much of that is being piped back to Moscow, right? The system needs to take in all this information about what's going on around it and what's in the air and who's flying and where and what are the signatures assigned to each of these things. And all of that information is supposed to be processed by, I guess, Turkish air defense personnel, but we don't know how much of it is just being piped out back to Moscow. What are they doing over at Incirlik Air Force Base or wherever this stuff is installed? Who's flying and what and where and why, and what does an F-35 look like to our air defense missile defense radar? Well, we don't know because the Americans rarely fly F-35s close enough to our radar installations for us to get a good look at how they operate and what they look like to us, let's say. I don't know whether that's necessarily the case. But if they're operating one of our systems in Turkey and flying F-35s out of that same base in Turkey, well, then we have the opportunity to pipe back to Moscow. What does an F-35's radar signature look like to our missile defense systems in real time and in real life? That seems like a bad idea, don't you think? Last paragraph of this piece here. Days after Turkey accepted the S-400, the U.S. booted the nation from the F-35 program, probably for that reason. In response, Russia offered to sell Turkey its upgraded Su-35 fighters, and Turkey threatened to attack then U.S. allied Kurdish units in Syria. So, wow, that is pretty interesting. And now we have a better feel for the relationship that Lindsey Graham sees between the incidents in Syria and the fights with the Kurds and the Turkish acceptance of the S-400 and the importance of the F-35 program. So at least we had the foresight to say, all right, well, there won't be any F-35s operating in and around Turkey. You're out of the F-35 program because of your S-400s. But interesting that Turkish response is, oh, yeah, well, in that case, one, we might buy our planes from Russia. Bad news for the NATO alliance. And two, P.S., we might also retaliate against you kicking us out of the F-35 program by attacking Kurds in Syria. And then we ended up letting them attack the Kurds in Syria as well. And we don't have, I don't know, I mean, I guess that we can't reward them by putting them back on the F-35 program. But what a mess these guys have let it become, and maybe just because they're incompetent idiots. But But by God, there are incompetent idiots, and we're going to impeach them. So, I don't know. I found that thing very informative as well. Here's a bit of news that we have ignored to this point, and somebody made an excellent point in tweeting about it yesterday. Amazing that this happened, and nobody seems to be talking about it. Not even big news, not even top 10 story, that, yes, Trump's fourth Secretary of Homeland Security has just resigned. Kevin McClellan. I don't know whether he ever proceeded beyond the acting level, but apparently he's out as well. And man, that makes, I guess our next one will be our fifth Homeland Security. If only Homeland Security were a priority for Republicans in general or this president. Interesting that he feels like he can play such games with it. But we have the Jonathan Blitzer's, another Jonathan for our Jonathan Corner. Jonathan Blitzer at the New Yorker has written this piece, Why Trump's fourth Secretary of Homeland Security just resigned, and perhaps we could find out in the few minutes we have left. Because I don't know, and I missed the whole thing. When Kevin McClellan became the, acting Secretary of Homeland Security in April, it's only since April, a DHS official who knew McClellan personally told me, I'm not sure how he can finesse things with this administration. Yeah, I guess he didn't. Donald Trump had just fired Kirstjen Nielsen, the former official in the George W. Bush administration, despite the fact that she had championed some of the Trump administration's harshest immigration policies, including family separation. McClellan, who had served in the Obama administration, was widely regarded as a Democrat. He publicly opposed Trump's decision earlier that spring to cut aid to Central America and was taking over the department at a moment when more than 100,000 migrants were being apprehended at the border every single month. Wow. On Friday, after 6 months in the post, McClellan resigned, becoming one of the shortest-serving secretaries in the department's history. And it's not a long history. And yet, according to 3 people with knowledge of McClellan's thinking, the secretary had somehow managed to leave the Trump administration mostly on his own terms. The reasoning behind the decision, one of them told me, was 60% because he had achieved the mission objectives and 40% because he had to avoid being branded as Trump's border cop. McClellan's primary goal was reducing immigration to the U.S., which aligned him with the White House, but unlike Trump or his chief advisor, Stephen Miller, McClellan was never an anti-immigration ideologue. He is a technocrat and an institutionalist who had spent much of his career at Customs and Border Protection, a DHS sub-agency. In his view, mass migration was a humanitarian crisis, which threatened to overtake both DHS resources and the asylum system writ large. It was a problem, he once told me, that partisan Washington was unable to address. At the same time, according to another department official close to him, McClellan saw Trump's election as proof that an unsolved immigration crisis could carry dangerous political consequences. Interesting. In terms of immigration numbers, though, McClellan succeeded where his predecessors failed. He was the 4th person to lead the department in the Trump era, but the first with extensive experience in immigration policy. I wouldn't make a move or a decision in the immigration space without consulting Kevin first. Jay Johnson, who headed DHS under Obama, told me. Each of McClellan's predecessors, under sustained pressure from the White House, adopted drastic immigration measures, but immigration at the southern border continued to rise steadily. But at the start of 2019, it reached its highest levels in more than a decade. That's interesting, too. McClellan responded with a controversial slate of policies that enlisted governments in Central America and Mexico to ramp up their own immigration enforcement. By September, the number of immigrants apprehended at the southern border had declined by 63%. Well, okay, there is that. That's something, I guess. Trump never exactly soured on McClellan, but he undercut him. For one thing, the president did not formally nominate him for Senate confirmation, which eroded his standing within the administration. DHS consists of 22 agencies with an annual budget of $50 billion and some 240,000 employees spanning the Secret Service, the FEMA, the Coast Guard, Transportation Security Administration, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and others. Its portfolio includes briefs related to domestic terrorism, cybersecurity, and disaster relief. We always had to work extremely hard to make sure the department didn't get turned into a political tool. Too late for that. One former DHS official told me last year. We tried to run it like other departments that were above the fray, but it'll always be a challenge because of the immigration issue. That's probably all we'll have time for in this rather extensive article, but you should peruse it for yourself and see if it gives us any insight into where things are going. Early word is that Ken Cuccinelli might actually be under consideration for this one, but as I recall, Mitch McConnell was opposed to him intractably at some point, so we'll see whether that changes anytime soon. Time now, though, for us to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. What's he got on tap for you today that I didn't get to? Let's see. Well, if Trump continues to try and run out the clock on the impeachment probe, he'll go down in flames like Nixon. That's his prediction anyway. Oh, Mark Zuckerberg in the news, of course. He'll tell you all about what happened yesterday.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Here's something about McConnell, too, vowing to block a House prescription drug plan that would save $345 billion by negotiating for lower insulin prices. So, of course, you can't have that. And a classified document written in the 1970s by Henry Kissinger explains Trump's abandonment of the Kurds today. I'd love to hear about that. Stay tuned.